I'd like to welcome Andy Coravos. I met Andy when she was entrepreneur in residence at the Food and Drug Administration and have just been really impressed with her from that time forward. She is the CEO of Elektra Labs, which she'll talk a little bit about, but she is also one of the most diverse thinkers I have ever met in the space. She's everywhere. She's at DEF CON, right, getting the FDA to talk to hackers. She is a co-founder of the Digital Medicine Society. And she is someone who I admire enormously. And as a disclosure of conflict, I've agreed to join Elektra as an advisor because of how much I believe in this person. So she's going to give us a keynote. You know that you're being recorded, so don't cuss unless you really want it to be there. And so if we can ask you to hold questions till the end because of the recording, that would be great. To be clear, we are not going to record and distribute the Q&A. So you don't have to worry about your own privacy in that. Only the speakers who are doing slides will be recorded today.
All right. So I'm Andy, and so John thinks he met me when I was an entrepreneur in residence at the FDA, but little does he know I actually was stalking him way before that. He had asked me to share a little bit of like personal stories and things that I've learned over time. And one of the things that I've learned, which I was talking about with one of my teammates, is Twitter is amazing. And so John's really good at Twitter. So one, if you don't have Twitter, there's a whole community, or security researchers, Dime, everybody else, there's a whole community online on Twitter. Follow John. And then if you have questions and you know you're not going to remember them later, you can tweet them to me, and I'm going to save time afterwards, and we'll reply there too. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about digital medicine and what that means and where that is in the terms of digital health, and some around how accurate these tools are, human factors, and give some tips on what I view as ethical research. It's funny for me to even give this talk because this whole world is very new, and I think a lot of what I end up doing is just defining what I think things are and where I'm drawing the lines, but I think as a whole industry we are in a very big line drawing exercise. So if you feel like I drew a line in a way that you disagree with, that's where we learn where the line should be. So bring that up. Okay, so I co-founded Elektra, which is a digital medicine platform. I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. And I also serve as a member of the Harvard-MIT Center for Regulatory Sciences, where we're defining different parts of digital medicine and what it looks like. Previously served at the FDA. My views are mine and mine alone, and I do not represent the United States government in any views that I have around regulation. I was a software engineer at a digital therapeutics company that I'll tell you about, and then had a smattering of businessy things. Okay, so this is my sister and me, and I grew up in a very big healthcare family. And my mom is a nurse, my dad is a dentist. We would talk about healthcare all the time growing up. I am abysmally bad with blood. Like, I have to sit if blood's gonna get drawn. I was working at Boston Children's, and people would come in with things, and I'd be like, oh God, I don't know. And so my family always wondered how I would be in the healthcare community, given that I have this issue. And now I have discovered that it was gonna be through software, so I finally can like be part of my family. And so today what I'm going to talk to you a bit about is what do I mean by digital medicine, and what are some of the scopes of how I think about these different types of tools. We'll do a couple deep dives, like eat your greens around, and I'll try to make it not super painful, but like what does it actually mean if you're a regulated researcher or not, and like are you working with regulated products or not? Do you know? Does the FDA know? And then give some thoughts that I have around an evaluation framework, but a lot of people here are far better experts than I am, so you'll get to really dive into that today. Okay, I love this photo. Dr. Saxon from USC had originally showed it to me. So it is people visiting the Pope in 2005. This is people visiting the Pope 8 years later in 2013, which is 5 years ago. We have a totally different paradigm around local compute power than we've ever had, and this is what, in my view, is driving a lot of the changes in digital medicine. And before we start, I'm a stickler on definitions, or at least trying to define what we mean by them. And I think many people will say, like, is something validated? And that first question should be like, what do you mean by validated? Or is something a biomarker? Is it a biomarker? Is it a measurement? So a couple people all came together and made a book. And to make it a little bit more interesting, we hired a graphic novel person to help make cartoons around this. This is all public and open access. All these slides will be available, and I can send them to you so you can check this out afterwards, and I'll go through a couple of the definitions I think will be helpful for today's conversation. So one area where I'm not going to spend as much time, but other people might, around digital tools are a set of outcome assessments. So these are things you might be familiar with, like patient-reported outcomes, whether clinician-reported, observer-reported. Generally, regulators put an E in front of everything to make it electronic, so e-patient, e-pro. In the advent of technology, there starts to be a little bit of wiggle room. So like, would we have a machine-reported outcome? If it's the sensor carrying something, do we need to add a fifth one? And that is still something that's relatively unknown, which you can engage with, and I'll show you how. There's another class of things where it's really focused on the software and algorithms, not the human that's doing the input. And so the way I like to think about that is like in this world of digital medicine, which is these different types of algorithms, the algorithms might measure, it might diagnose, or it might treat. We wrote a piece in Wired to introduce some of these concepts, and I'm going to go through each of them. So measurements might include things like digital biomarkers or clinical decision support. If the algorithm then makes a diagnosis, which in some instances might be a form of measurement, I'll show you some of those. And then if software can measure and diagnose, can it also treat? And if they're going to do any of these things, you have to make sure that you really trust what these algorithms are being built on. So digital biomarkers are measuring behavioral and physiological data. Who here is not wearing some sort of smartwatch? Yes, we have lots of privacy people here. That's good. So if you think about what these tools are doing, they're taking data like from your accelerometer and gyroscope, and then they're predicting whether or not you're making a step. They're not actually measuring whether or not you're making a step. So all these things are algorithms in different ways. Sometimes they have software components, sometimes they're a combination of hardware and software. I think one area where people get really confused is it a measurement or is it a biomarker? And it turns out that it's not just in the digital land that people are getting confused. Across the entire FDA, they were as well, for even non-digital biomarkers, for like wet lab biomarkers. So in 2016, Dr. Califf, who was running the FDA at the time, commissioned a group across the FDA and NIH, and they defined what a biomarker means. And they came up with 7 different types of biomarkers. This is a very dry publication, but I'd highly recommend that you read it, because when somebody comes to you and says, hey, we're measuring a digital biomarker, I would posture that is not an 8th type of biomarker. It's a way of collecting one of the 7. And so you really should understand which type of the 7 biomarkers you're measuring, and then think about what is that mechanism of collection. Okay, so a couple of examples of diagnostics. AFib is a type of rare, or not rare, it's actually quite common. It is a type of abnormal heart condition. And there's a number of tools in the market that say that they might be able to either identify or diagnose AFib. And I love this because as a software engineer, I like to think about like who along that stack is actually diagnosing and like where does that diagnostic come from? And so what you can see on the left-hand side are 5 different products that have or are building AFib products, from AliveCor, Cardiogram, Apple. And then across the top is different parts of the stack. So the operating system, the sensor, so a lot of them use PPG, which is this green light that sits on the back of your device or tool, and then you'll do some sort of signal processing. After you process that signal, you would have an algorithm that actually says yes or no that AFib exists, and then you would display that information in an app. All of these have a number of components where they might be building internally, or somebody might be building on top of the product, or they're working with other different groups. So if you are the FDA and someone says, hey, I have an AFib product, which part of this chunk are you actually evaluating? And you can see that some people are more hardware focused, some are more software focused, and this, we'll get into in a little bit, starts getting really wonky. Like, where do you draw the line of like, what is the device here? And what parts do you need to validate? So if someone makes a change in the operating system, do you have to revalidate all of the different types? And this is a very tricky question. So these tools are quite popular, and the FDA has started to clear some of them as software as a medical device, which I'll get into. Has anyone used, I'm just curious, has anyone used any of the AFib products? Some? Okay. All right, so software can measure, it can diagnose, possibly, in some instances, and can it treat? So this is, there's a company called Achille, which I worked at, and they developed technology out of UCSF that looks at kids who have pediatric ADHD, and they have found when kids play what looks and feels like a video game, they're able to reduce their ADHD symptoms. So it's a 30-day protocol when I was last there, and they have structured themselves like a drug company. So they test the asset like it's a drug instead of Ritalin or Adderall. They run the same endpoints that you would evaluate a drug on. And the cool thing about the game is that with a lot of drugs, you're just suppressing the symptoms in that moment. With the game, when they test the kids 6 months after, it's still about 80% as effective. So it's restructuring part of the brain, which I think is really exciting. So they are now submitting to the FDA, and they might be the first prescription video game. So how many people here were told that video games would rot your brain? Yes, you have vindication now. So FDA has started to have a lot more of these different algorithms that are coming through. I personally try to not use the term AI because I just don't like it very much. There's a funny tweet that I love that if it's written in Python, it's machine learning, and if it's written on a PowerPoint slide, it's AI. And for me, all of these things are just different types of algorithms. Some of them learn, some of them don't, and so we need to just evaluate what they look like. And so, and I'll get into it a little bit more, the FDA has started to work with a number of different groups to figure out, like, how do we handle these sorts of things and what do they look like? Okay, I'll go through these kind of quickly, but there's some other terms that would be helpful. These tools that can collect remote data can spark things called, like, decentralized clinical trials. In any tech community, I should be very clear, there are no blockchains in these trials yet, maybe. Decentralized clinical trials have two components. One is how the data are collected, so whether or not they're collected using these sorts of sensors, and then where are they collected. So I would say that if you're calling in a trial and you're using telemedicine, but somebody's writing down, your clinician's writing down the score, or the PI's writing down the score, then that would be a remote trial, but you're not collecting the data digitally because you're collecting it manually. Or if you're using maybe one of these sensors to measure someone's tremor in a Parkinson's study, you might actually do it in the clinic. So that would be a virtual trial, but not necessarily remote. And so, and I don't think we should necessarily have fully decentralized trials. Like I would never want to draw my own blood. Like I'd want a phlebotomist to do that. So I think there are many instances where you fit on this line really depends on like what the needs are in a study. Regulatory is always kind of painful. I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly, but just give people a balance of what's happening. Okay, so the way that I like to think about this is if you think about a clinical trial, you have an intervention. That could be a drug, that could be a piece of software or something that's intervening, and then you measure how that product is doing. And the software could either be on the intervention side or it could be on the data collection side. So a traditional drug company might collect data digitally, and so that would be like a digital endpoint. That would not be regulated through CDRH, which is the devices group. That would just be regulated through a normal drug trial. You might have a digital therapeutic like Achille, and then they might have endpoint data collected traditionally, so that might not be digital. Or you might have an instance where you're both have software both with the intervention and with how you're collecting the data. So with something like an artificial pancreas, you're measuring how their CGM ratings are and then dosing their insulin off of that. And so that might be something more like a combination product. There's a lot here of nuances that I know my regulatory colleagues would say I'm oversimplifying, but I think this is an important question of like where is the software in that research and a way to think about it. There's a number of different regulators that oversee this. There's not really just one. So there's obviously the Food and Drug Administration. Because a lot of these have connectivity, the FCC is also involved. A lot of this has data rights and management, so ONC is involved. And then there's a number of different consumer protection groups, and I'll go through these quickly. Something that's interesting about the FDA is that they're assuring the safety and effectiveness of drugs and devices, but they don't test it. So they are just seeing what you claim to do and checking your claims, which will have impacts later. FTC is a very small org, I think under-resourced right now, and they are making sure that you don't have deceptive or unfair practices. In many instances, FTC has been the org that has gone after digital health companies that have made deceptive claims, not necessarily the FDA. And if you think about them, they're both very similar. So they both oversee promotion and advertising, so the marketing of these materials. The one difference with the FDA is it has a public health perspective for it. And all these slides will be available, but the FDA has started to do some really innovative things around thinking about how they're going to handle these different types of digital tools. One is this idea of software as a medical device, which we touched on earlier. So the idea here is that you would decouple the hardware from the software. So if you have an app that sits on an iPhone, you could just submit the app software component as a medical device and review it that way. And as an aside, because we'll all talk about this here, the term device I generally try to minimize unless it is actually a device per FDA, which is a term of art. And so I'll use terms like connected tool or others because sometimes it is or not a device. So we'll play a game. Whether or not your product is a device, you should definitely talk to your regulatory lawyer. And the example that I'm going to give is metaphorical rather than factual. Okay, so we have two products. Which one of these is a device? Who's going to be the brave soul who guesses? So we have an Apple product on the left, and we have a Fitbit on the right. Okay, so make your note. So Apple has submitted a piece of software, a couple of different pieces of software. So neither of the hardware components are devices per FDA. The Apple has submitted an AFib product that was cleared, not approved. And we can talk about clearance and approval if you want to go down the FDA rabbit hole. And so Apple has a software product that is a device, and currently Fitbit does not have any products that are a device. If you're given two Apple Watches, how do you know which one has the software that has the device software and which one does not have the device software? You would have to check the FDA docs of which version of the software has a device on it or not. So this is really a quick trick question. And one of the things that you should know about devices and whether or not is not what the product actually does, it's what the manufacturer claims the product can do. So the exact same product can be a device or not a device through no change in code, no change in hardware, and just a change in words in what you're claiming the product does. And so this causes like a whole slew of issues for whether or not you have regulated research or unregulated research, because many of these tools have functionality that could be device-like functionality, but because the manufacturer has not made a claim, it may not actually have FDA oversight for the different type of tooling that you're using. We can go into this in Q&A, but a lot of there's a relatively large legal gap right now and regulatory gap for overseeing tech products. There's a number of people who have small oversight, but there's really not a body that would oversee digital specimens, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, so a lot of regulatory. How do I know if this product is fit for purpose? Okay, raise your hand if you know what DEF CON is. Oh, I love this group. Okay, so DEF CON is one of the biggest hacker conferences. It happens every year. This year was the 27th year. And DEF CON, there's lots of ways to define DEF CON, but there are about 30 villages that sit under main DEF CON. One that you might have heard of is called the Voting Village, and they had a number of different voting machines last year that were pretty famous, where people bought them from different states. They hacked them. They found the individual voter records that were obviously not supposed to be found, and then submitted those to Congress and said, hey, like, you should fix this. There is a group within DEF CON called the Biohacking Village. And the Biohacking Village does some biohacking, and they also do what's called security research. So there's loosely black hat hackers who will hack a system for personal gain, and then there are white hat hackers who hack systems to find different types of vulnerabilities, and then they'll work with the manufacturer to ethically disclose and make them stronger. So there are a number of researchers who were looking at things like insulin pumps and like pacemakers, and they found vulnerabilities. And as engineers, you'd be pretty horrified at the level of like how easy it is. So a pacemaker company tries to maximize battery life. To maximize battery life, they don't do a lot of things that are computationally expensive. Turns out encryption is computationally expensive. So the exploit for pacemakers is like relatively trivial. They stay in a low power mode. If you reverse engineer the unencrypted protocol, you can ping the pacemaker and drain a multi-year battery life into a couple days or weeks. They were also able to reverse engineer, pacemakers can deliver a shock upon a cardiac event, and so they could deliver the shock. And so when they found this, in any normal tech instance, you would go to like, Facebook or Amazon and say like, hey, we found a vulnerability, and those tech companies would say, thank you, they ship an update, there's possibly a bug bounty program where you get paid, there's like a flow of how you would handle security research. With the med device companies, they said, thank you, we're gonna sue you now. And the researchers are like, wait, what, why? And they're like, well, you tampered with our devices, we're regulated by the FDA, we can't just ship updates whenever we want, so we now have to sue you. And a lot of security researchers are not particularly motivated by money, but they are very motivated by fairness. And I would say if you found a flaw in Snapchat that feels, manageable, but like if you can kill somebody with a pacemaker, this feels pretty significant. And so this really got to be quite a heated situation. And the FDA found out about it, and they were like, wait, one, myth. If you do have a security issue, particularly if it does not change the functionality of the device, not only can you ship an update without having to do a re-review, you must ship an update. And also, who are security researchers and like, what are you all doing? Which is very exciting because FDA is a very curious group, which is wonderful. And so they said, what is DEF CON and how do you all operate? And the head of Biohacking Village was like, do you want to come? And that is it. For anyone who has not attended DEF CON, that is a pretty unique thing that's only happened in the last couple of years. There used to be a game called Spot the Fed, and like you did not want to be spotted when you were there. And like NSA goes, CIA goes, but they generally did not go like as feds publicly. I'm on this one too long. And so, I'm just going to restart my computer. So FDA started attending DEF CON 3 years ago. And that has become a very fruitful thing where the researchers have now started to work and help develop pre- and post-market guidances from the FDA. And the FDA in January started a thing called #WeHeartHackers, which you can search on Twitter, which is amazing. And they encouraged groups like Medtronic, BD, Thermo Fisher, Abbott to all attend DEF CON and collaborate with security researchers. So I'm one of the advisors for the Biohacking Village. We had over 40 medical devices there this year, which is amazing, and 10 manufacturers, and Mayo Clinic set up a whole fake network. So if you're looking to hack and tinker like on different things, please come. You can try to take down the Mayo Clinic network and then disclose to them, which is pretty cool. 2 of our teammates are here, and there were, I should have gotten more. We actually had there's a 4th who you can try to find, so 3 bonus points if you find the people who have attended DEF CON in the last year. The group at DEF CON also has a pretty interesting background where they're realizing, okay, so we have all these connected devices that are changing or augmenting the role of a clinician. Clinicians take Hippocratic oath to do no harm. Should the security engineers, the data scientists, and others who are building these tools also take Hippocratic oath? And what would that look like? And so they built the first case of Hippocratic oath for connected medical devices and then published in an academic journal, which I think is amazing. I think this was one of the first times an academic journal published hacker research. So you can check this out online. So this kind of brings like a whole question around, it's not just Internet of Things, but now we also have Internet of Bodies. So we have things like pacemakers, cochlear implants, and things aren't just sitting on the outside. And our healthcare system has really strong protections for biospecimens like blood or genomic data, but they don't really have good protections around digital specimens. And so this has a number of implications. I think in many instances people say, well, it's fine, we can just anonymize your data. But my question is, how would you actually anonymize my data? Like, you can't really make, like, how would you anonymize my genetic data? That's unique to me. I'm uniquely identifiable with 30 seconds of walk data. And so what ends up happening is that you can't, and my slides are not in the order that I wanted, but so as a result, there's not a lot of ways to own your data, which is something I learned from Sage, like the way you can own your car or you can own your house, but it is much more about your data rights and your data management. So who gets your data and when starts to become a really important question that more people today will go into. And that has some pretty significant instances because everything that you have are effectively predictions. Algorithms are just predictions. Depending on how those data are trained can have pretty meaningful impacts of what decisions are made for you. So one, and I think many of the unintended consequences are not people intentionally like trying to harm one group, but they just have been trained differently. So for example, back to the heart rate data that we talked about, these PPGs are looking at how light is absorbed through skin. Different types of skin have different levels of light absorption. And so some people were starting to find that so like people who have, there was like a tattoo gate where people who had tattoos just weren't registering any data, so they just looked like they were dead. And so if you have these like big data sets and across a very diverse population, you have to make sure that the data that you're collecting from them are accurate. And so this is one that I would definitely recommend reading more about. Okay, so, and something that I think will be really important for us to get into is, given that we want to make sure that these tools are accurate and you're not always sure who they're trained on, who reads their end user license agreements here? Probably some of you feel like this is, this is a group. So there was a pretty famous study that I really like that if you read every end user license agreement that the average internet user finds over the course of their year, how many business days do you think it would take you to do that? 20? 200. It's actually not a bad guess. So it would be 76 days, and most of us are not trained lawyers, so reading that is a pretty gnarly system. So what we're probably going to talk a lot about today is what is that social contract that we need when we're agreeing to operate in these sorts of systems when you're collecting digital specimen data. And I think there's inherent tensions where we're not going to always have a clean answer. So I am really excited about the advent of personalized care. I do wear one of these, but I think you can't really have personalized care without creating one of the biggest surveillance systems that we've ever had. I mean, this is probably some version of 1984. And so the question is, like, what version of that do we want to have, and who is going to be governing that? Okay. Only because I think this is a very important part of your civic duty. I think everyone in this room and everyone listening should participate in the rulemaking process for that governance process. So there's a few ways to do that. You can serve a tour of duty within government. And so FDA is hiring, not just FDA, but all of these agencies are hiring people often through what's called the Digital Services, U.S. Digital Service. And so this is like, instead of serving a tour of duty in the Army, you would serve a tour of duty in government. The other way to do it, and look at this amazing piece of software, is through the public docket. So a lot of agencies will publish their rulemaking guidances online, and people don't generally comment on them. But if you do, the agency is required to read every single comment that is in there. And so you can have a very meaningful impact to do that. I realize I pulled this, but the FDA had an AI/ML white paper that was on due in June. And so a number of people, when I gave a talk at MIT, were able to comment on that paper. And I would not assume particularly that anyone who's writing these docs, sometimes they have experts and sometimes they don't. So if something sounds weird, it probably is weird, and you should just comment on that and define it in the way that you would best understand it. There's a number of reasons to submit public comments, but my friend Mina wrote a really nice piece about how to do that. And so few people have the opportunity to be that voice, and so this is a really powerful and meaningful way that you can participate in the process. The other way you can participate is just writing and putting your thoughts online. And so in this world where a lot of things are pretty new, you can start to develop new frameworks. So for example, one thing that I had written earlier with a couple friends of mine started just over drinks, and then we realized there's a lot of ways that we might want to think about AI and these different types of algorithm development in terms of clinical trials. So drugs have adverse events, algorithms can have adverse events. You want to train them on different types of population. And so we wrote a piece about how to think about the framework for developing algorithms and should it be similar to the way that we develop drugs. I had never really published or written op-eds before, and it's a not bad process to write something up and then pitch to editors. I'm happy to talk to you about that. Another way that you can get involved is spurring from that idea around the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices. So doctors have professional societies that they can join, like ASCO, Society of Neuro-Oncology. What is the professional society for people like us in this room who practice in the digital era of medicine, for the software engineers, for the data scientists, and where would they go? And so this group called the Digital Medicine Society launched in March, and I'd highly recommend that all of you can join and be part of this community. And a couple of things that DIME's working on is defining many of these terms. So a lot of the papers that you've talked about have been written in there. I'm actually curious, how many people here have already joined DIME? Yes. All right, that's a number of you. All right, do this if you do one thing after this talk. Okay, so we've talked about regulatory, we've talked about communities. How do you actually know if these tools are trustworthy? And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're working on with Elektra, and then I think we've started to dig into this, but I think this is a much bigger question than just us, so I hope this sparks a longer conversation over the course of the day. So what we do is we work with pharma companies that are trying to use these digital tools in their clinical trials and figuring out which type of tool would be the best for them. And then over time, the philosophy is, as more and more of these tools get cleared and approved by the FDA and have more evidence, we're going to need pharmacies that distribute these. And so the pharmacies that distribute drugs are not really well equipped to understand the security and data rights issues and how to handle these different types of digital products. So we're going to need a different type of organization to do that. And so Elektra that's what we're looking to grow into. And so when we think about the evaluation, we had originally started with the work from Citi, which I'd highly recommend if you're looking at either working on novel endpoints or mobile technologies. And we've been building out an atlas of all these different types of connected tools. And so we think about whether or not these tools are fit for purpose across a number of different factors. So generally, people always ask us, like, how accurate are the tools? So that is often an idea around verification and validation. So for example, verification simply would be, if I walk 100 steps, does the thing measure 100 steps? And then validation would be, does 100 steps mean something for my Parkinson's? And like, what does that mean for my population? Human factors are, even if the data is accurate, like if I have to recharge it every day, can I wear it in the shower? Does it look like a prison bracelet when I go outside? Like, what is the usability? And most people just stop with those two questions. And we've been pushing more to think about the security practices. So all these tools are connected to the internet. Anything that's connected to the internet will be hacked. It's not an if, it's a when. And so how do you handle those sorts of patches and updates when that happens? And then data rights and governance. So Cambridge Analytica was not a hack. That was a feature, not a bug. And so many companies are sharing data in ways that the people who are participating may or may not know. The other thing that's crazy, because you all are developers, is the lawyers that write the end user license agreements often aren't talking with the developers who are building the architecture. So in many instances, what's written in the end user license agreement is not what's actually happening with the app. And so this is why the work that Sage is doing is so powerful, because figuring out how you make sure that those two things actually align, so what you say you're doing, you're actually doing, is really important. And the way that we like to think about these is, like, for any of these different types of tools, I think people come to us and they like want us to score them like it's wine. So it's like, oh, the Fitbit's a 92.5 and the Actigraph's like, a 40 whatever. But really, you can think about it more like a nutrition label. And so, and people use this analogy in lots of different ways over probably the course of the day, but sometimes you need more protein, sometimes you need more sugar, sometimes you need a certain type of vitamin C. And so depending on what you need, you might pull on accuracy or usability or security to find out the right sort of tool. We've been writing our views across these different types of technologies, and so I would love to continue. I think we're still very much in the learning process of what matters and like what's a floor versus optional, and so hope to engage with you on that conversation. So we'll go into questions, but I think for me, this is a really exciting time because no one really knows the answers yet about how this world is going to get shaped. And in tech, the whole move fast and break things in healthcare means people die. And so I would prefer that doesn't happen. But I think we definitely need to move somewhat faster than we're moving. Having governors in the system like the FDA are, I think, both important and just making sure that those are really thoughtful. And so the reason why I love meetings like today is that we can be much more intentional about the type of future that we build instead of an accidental one. And so I'm very grateful that you have me here and happy to answer questions.